It is around the year 524 in a prison somewhere in northern Italy. A man who was a year ago the most powerful official in the kingdom, friend of the king, master of all the great offices of state, sits in a cell awaiting his own execution. He has been condemned without a fair hearing. He will be killed. He has lost his freedom, his fortune, his titles, his good name, and very soon he will lose his life. And in that cell, with nothing left, he begins to write. He writes a conversation between himself, sunk in despair, and a woman who appears in his cell, tall and ageless, who tells him she is philosophy, and that she has come to remind a forgetful patient of what he already knows. The book he wrote in that cell would become one of the most read, most loved, most consoling books in the entire history of Europe. He did not live to see a single reader. His name is Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. He was born around the year 477 into one of the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families of Rome, a family of consuls and statesmen, ancient even by Roman standards. But the world he was born into was not the Rome of the emperors. The Western Roman Empire had fallen a generation before, and Italy was now ruled by a king of the Ostrogoths, a Germanic ruler named Theodoric. It was, by the standards of the time, a relatively stable and cultured kingdom. And Theodoric needed educated Roman aristocrats to help him govern. And Boethius was the most brilliant of them all. Picture the life he built. He was extraordinarily learned, perhaps the last man in the West for centuries who could still read Greek philosophy fluently, and who set himself the immense task of translating and preserving the great Greek thinkers for a Latin world he could see was forgetting them. He was wealthy. He was honored. He rose through the highest offices of the kingdom. He was made consul, the ancient supreme honor of Rome. And then something happened that the sources record with a kind of wonder. Both of his sons, while still young men, were made consuls in the same year. And Boethius sat between them in the place of highest honor and delivered the public oration. He was, at that moment, by his own later account, as fortunate as a human being could be. He had the learning, the wealth, the family, the offices, the king's favor, the love of his city. He had, in the language of this channel, a hold packed completely full with every good thing the second column can contain. He was standing at the very summit. And the thing about a summit is that there is only one direction left to travel. The fall came fast, and it came, as these things often do, from politics. Boethius, in his role as a high official, defended another senator who had been accused of treason against the king. In doing so, Boethius made powerful enemies at court, and those enemies turned the king's suspicion onto Boethius himself. He was accused of treason, of conspiring against Theodoric, of plotting with the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. Boethius insists in everything he later wrote that the charges were false, that the evidence was forged, that he was condemned by his enemies without ever being allowed to properly defend himself. Whatever the precise truth of the politics, the result is not in doubt. Boethius was stripped of his offices, his property was confiscated, he was arrested, imprisoned, and sentenced to death. In the space of what seems to have been about a year, the most fortunate man in the kingdom became a condemned prisoner in a cell, waiting to be killed. The entire second column, all of it, every piece, was torn away at once. Now we come to the book itself, and to one of the most remarkable creative decisions in the history of literature. Boethius, in his cell, condemned to die, sat down to write, and the book he wrote is called The Consolation of Philosophy. And he did not write it as a straightforward essay, or a complaint, or a memoir of his fall. He wrote it as a drama, as a conversation. The book opens with Boethius in his cell, sunk in misery, weeping, writing self-pitying verses about his ruined fortune. And then into the cell comes a visitor. A woman, tall, of an age impossible to determine, with burning eyes, wearing a robe she had woven herself. Now somewhat torn, she is not a real person. She is an allegory, a figure. She tells him who she is. She is philosophy herself, personified. Come in person to the cell of a man who was once her devoted student, and has now, in his distress, forgotten everything she ever taught him. Think about the strangeness and the genius of that choice. Boethius is utterly alone. He has no friends in the cell, no advocate, no comforter, no one. So he does something extraordinary. He splits himself in two. He puts his despairing self, the frightened, grieving, self-pitying prisoner, into one character called Boethius. And he puts everything he has ever learned, the entire accumulated wisdom of the philosophical tradition he spent his life mastering, into the other character called philosophy. And then he has them argue. The book is the prisoner's despair being met, point by point, objection by the prisoner's own deeper knowledge, given a voice and a face and sent to sit beside him on the cell floor. It is one of the most honest depictions ever written of what it actually feels like to apply a philosophy to your own suffering, because it does not feel like serenely knowing the right answer. It feels exactly like this, like a divided self, one part drowning, the other part throwing it. Again and again, the rope it already owns. And the first thing philosophy does when she sees the state Boethius is diagnostic. She looks at the self-pitying verses he has been writing, and she is not gentle about them. She calls the muses of poetry that have been keeping him company words of the stage, sweet poisons that feed a grief instead of healing it. She drives them out of the cell. She tells Boethius that he is not suffering from a disaster. He is suffering from forgetfulness. He has, she says, simply forgotten what he is and where he stands. He has fallen so far into the second column, so deep into mourning the lost fortune, that he has lost sight of the first column entirely. And so she announces her method. She will not begin with the strong medicine. She will begin gently with mild remedies, and only when he is stronger will she apply the powerful arguments. The whole book is structured as a course of treatment, a sick man slowly, in stages, being argued back to health by the personified sum of his own best knowledge. The first great argument philosophy makes to the condemned man is the one the book is most famous for, and it is a direct, unflinching look at the thing that has destroyed him. Boethius's complaint, stripped down, is this: I had everything, and fortune has taken it all away, and that is a betrayal, and it is unjust. And philosophy's answer is to let fortune speak for herself. She gives a voice to fortune, to the blind, turning force that distributes wealth and power and status, and lets fortune answer the charge of betrayal directly. And fortune's reply is one of the coldest and clearest passages in the book. Fortune says, in effect, betrayal. What betrayal? Why do you accuse me of taking your things away? They were never your things. They were mine. Fortune says, I have a wheel, and turning it is my entire nature. It is the only thing I do. I lift people up, and I bring people down, and the wheel never stops, because a wheel that stopped would not be a wheel. When you climbed onto my wheel, you knew, or you should have known, what kind of wheel it was. I lent you wealth, I lent you office and honor in the favor of a king. I never sold them to you, I never gave them to you. I lent them on the single unchanging condition that I could recall them whenever the wheel turned. And now the wheel has turned, as wheels do, as this wheel has always done. And I have taken back what was always mine to take back. And you call it betrayal. You have no more right to complain than a man who borrowed a cloak and is now indignant that the owner wants it returned. This is, of course, the dividing line, the central teaching of this whole channel, dressed in a magnificent and unforgettable image. Fortune's wheel is simply the second column made vivid. Wealth, power, status, reputation, the favor of the powerful, all of it rides on the wheel. All of it is on loan. None of it was ever truly Boethius's. And the agony of his fall, philosophy is showing him, comes almost entirely from a single error he made at the summit. When he had everything, he forgot it was borrowed. He let himself believe that the things on the wheel were his own possessions, his own foundation, part of his very self. And so when the wheel turned, it did not feel like the return of borrowed goods. It felt like a part of him was being torn away. But fortune is showing him that nothing of his was torn away at all. The wheel simply did what wheels do. And there is a hard mercy buried inside that cold speech, and Boethius is meant to find it. If the things were only ever on loan, then their loss, however painful, is not an injustice and not a mutilation. It is the expiry of a loan, and a man can grieve the end of a loan, but he need not feel on top of the grief. The special torment of believing that the universe has singled him out for a betrayal. But philosophy does not stop with the wheel. The argument about fortune is, in the structure of the book, only the mild medicine, the gentle first remedy meant to calm the patient. It explains to Boethius why his loss is not a betrayal, but it does not yet give him anything to stand on. A man can accept that his fortune was borrowed and still be left standing in a cell with nothing, facing death. So philosophy moves in stages to the stronger medicine, and the stronger argument is the one that matters most for anyone listening, and it is this: if everything on fortune's wheel can be taken away, and it can, all of it, then those things were never the real good. They were never the thing a human being should have built their happiness on in the first place. The true good must be something else. It must be, by definition, something that cannot be taken. And so philosophy leads Boethius step by step through what people actually chase, and shows him that every single thing on the wheel fails the same test. People chase wealth, she says, but wealth does not even do what it promises. The rich man only acquires new fears, new dependence, new things to guard, and is more anxious, not less. People chase high office and power, but power is given by others and stripped by others. And the powerful are, as Boethius' own life proves, often the least safe people in the kingdom. People chase fame and reputation, but reputation is just opinion held in the minds of other people. People who will themselves die in a world that is itself a tiny speck, and across the long reach of time, even the greatest fame fades to nothing. People chase pleasure is brief, and its end is so often regret. One by one, philosophy takes every prize on fortune's wheel and shows the condemned man the same flaw in each. None of them is stable, none of them is fully yours. None of them, in the end, can deliver the thing the human heart is actually reaching for through all of them, which is a secure and complete happiness, a good that cannot be lost. And then philosophy makes the turn that the whole book has been building toward. If none of the things on the wheel is the true good, then where is the true good? And her answer is that it was never out there on the wheel at all. It was never among the things fortune lends and recalls. The true good, she argues, is found within, in wisdom, in virtue, in the right ordering of the soul, in the mind's own relationship to what is highest and most permanent. The good is a first column reality entirely. And here is the consequence that is the entire point of the book. If the true good lies in the first column, in your own character, your own mind, your own virtue, then fortune cannot reach it. The wheel does not turn there. Theodoric's guards could take Boethius' offices, his wealth, his freedom, his good name, and within days they would take his life. They had stripped the entire wheel bare. But the one thing they could not touch by their nature, they were structurally unable to touch it, was Boethius' own mind, his own wisdom, his own virtue, the inner good that no cell and no executioner has any power over. Boethius, in that cell condemned, had genuinely lost everything that could be lost. And philosophy's consolation is the demonstration that what could be lost was never, in the deepest sense, the good, and that the good itself, the real one, was still entirely in his possession on the floor of that cell where no one could come and take it. So let us ask the question this episode is built around. What is consolation? What does it actually mean to console someone or to console yourself in the face of a genuine, irreversible loss? Because there is a cheap and false version of consolation, and we have all received it, and we have all probably given it. The false version says, it is not so bad. Look on the bright side. It will all work out. Do not be sad. And that false consolation is useless, and worse than useless, for exactly the reason philosophy drove the muses of poetry out of the cell. It is a sweet poison. It tries to make the grief go away by denying the reality of the loss. And the sufferer knows the loss is real, and so the false consolation simply makes them feel unseen and more alone. Boethius' book is one of the greatest works of consolation ever written, precisely because it does the opposite. Philosophy never once tells Boethius that his situation is not bad. She never says the bright side. She never denies a single fact of his ruin. She fully concedes that he has lost his wealth, his office, his freedom, his name. She concedes that he will die. She does not soften the wheel. She describes it more starkly than he does. Real consolation, the book is showing us, never works by shrinking the loss. It works by changing the ground the sufferer is standing on. False consolation says your loss is smaller than you think. True consolation says your loss is exactly as large as you think, and you are standing on something larger. It does not argue you out of your grief. It widens the frame around the grief until the grief, still entirely real, is no longer the whole of the picture. And that is precisely the structure of what philosophy does across the whole book. She does not say to Boethius, you have not really lost anything. She says, you have truly lost everything fortune ever lent you. And now let me remind you patiently of everything that was never fortune's to lend, and is therefore still here. Your mind is still here. Your virtue is still here. Your capacity to reason, to understand, to love what is good and true and permanent, still here on the floor of this cell, untouched. The order of the cosmos, the reality of goodness itself, the highest things your soul was made to be in relationship with, the executioner has no jurisdiction over any of it. Consolation in Boethius' hands is the act of turning a person gently and by stages from a desperate fixation on the empty hands of the second column. Look what was taken. Look what was taken toward a clear sight of the still full hands of the first. It is not a lie told to the grieving. It is a truth shown to them. The truth that the loss, however total, however real, however much it deserves to be grieved, has not actually reached the core. That something remains, that something always remains, and that the something which remains is, in fact, the part that was always most worth having. And now I must put the hardest question of this entire channel to this book, because Boethius' situation forces it as no other does. Boethius was going to die. He did die. He was executed not long after finishing the book. So what good, you might fairly ask, is consolation to a man who is about to be killed anyway? What is the point of changing the ground he stands on, when in a few weeks he will not be standing anywhere? Isn't this, in the end, just an exquisitely intelligent way of whistling in the dark? It is the deepest possible version of the objection, and Boethius, of all people, has the standing to answer it, because he answered it not in comfort, but in a cell, with the date of his own death approaching. And here is the answer the book gives. The consolation was never a tool to escape death. Philosophy never promises Boethius that he will live. The consolation does something different, and the difference is the whole of its worth. It determines who Boethius will be in the time he is left, and how he will meet the end when it comes. A man can spend his final weeks as the despairing prisoner of the book's opening, drowning in self-pity, raging at fortune, his mind a wreck, defeated long before the executioner arrives. Or he can spend them as the man of the book's end, clear-minded, lucid, still reasoning, still in possession of himself, meeting his death as a free mind rather than a broken one. The consolation could not give Boethius more days. What it could give him, what it did give him, was the quality of the days he had and the manner of his death, and those, unlike the length of his life, were genuinely still his. The wheel sets the length of the loan. It was never permitted to set what you do with it. So how does a person actually use this without a cell, without a sentence of death? Because the structure of Boethius' catastrophe is, in a smaller key, the structure of every serious loss. The career that ends, the status that evaporates, the good name that is damaged, the role that defined you, suddenly gone. And for all of those, the consolation contains a practice, and it is concrete, and it begins on an ordinary day. First, while you are on the wheel, remember that you are on a wheel. Boethius' deepest error, the one philosophy identifies, was made not in the cell, but at the summit. At the height of his fortune, he forgot that his fortune was on loan. He let the borrowed things feel like owned things, like parts of himself. And that is the error to correct now. Today, while things are going well, because it cannot be corrected later, when your life contains good things, security, position, the regard of others, a plan unfolding as you hoped, practice deliberately, holding them as fortune's loans. Enjoy them fully. Philosophy never forbids the enjoyment, but say of each, quietly, this is Lent. The wheel is turning slowly even now. A man who has held his fortune as a loan all along is not destroyed when the loan is called. A man who held it as a possession is second. Build the inner kingdom now before you need it. The whole consolation depends on there being something in the first column for philosophy to point to. The reason Boethius could be consoled is that he had spent his entire life building an inner kingdom, a mind stocked with wisdom, a character shaped by virtue, a soul trained in philosophy. When the cell stripped away everything external, there was a furnished interior left to retreat into. If he had spent his life only on the wheel, only acquiring offices and wealth and fame, and never building the interior, then when the guards came, there would have been nothing inside but the despair, and philosophy would have walked into an empty room with nothing to remind him of. So the practice is to build the interior. Now, every act that genuinely strengthens your character, every piece of real wisdom you take in, every habit of virtue you train, you are furnishing the one kingdom the guards can never enter. You are not doing it for a future cell. Most of us will never see a literal one. You are doing it because a furnished interior makes an ordinary life richer and steadier every single day. And because if a catastrophe ever does strip the wheel bare, the difference between a person with an inner kingdom and a person without one is the difference between Boethius consoled and Boethius destroyed. And third, when loss comes, do for yourself what Boethius did. Split yourself in two on purpose. This is the most practical and the most surprising lesson of the whole book. When you are sunk in a grief or a fear, you are not actually only the drowning self. You also contain somewhere a wiser self, the part of you that has read and learned and watched others suffer. Well, the part that knows things the drowning self has temporarily forgotten. Boethius' act of genius was to give that wiser self a voice, to deliberately summon it, sit it down across from the despair, and let it speak, patiently in stages, answering each objection the despair raises. You can do this in writing, the way Boethius literally did it. A dialogue on a page between your frightened self and your wisest self, or quietly, deliberately in your own mind. The point is that consolation does not have to arrive from outside, from someone else. The Consolation of Philosophy was written by a man entirely alone, who consoled himself by giving his own deepest knowledge a face and a voice and letting it into the cell. The wiser self is already in you. The discipline is simply to call on it. on purpose and to let it do for you what philosophy did for Boethius. It would be dishonest to end without naming the hard part, because the consolation taken carelessly can be misread into something passive and even cowardly. It can sound like a counsel of pure retreat, withdraw entirely into your own mind, declare the whole external world to be fortune's worthless wheel, stop caring what happens out there, and so excuse yourself from ever fighting injustice, ever defending anyone, ever acting in the world at all. A philosophy of the locked interior, indifferent to everything beyond the cell door. But look at the actual life of the man who wrote it, because the life refutes the misreading completely. Boethius did not end up in that cell because he withdrew from the world. He ended up there because he did the opposite. He stood up in public as a high official and defended another senator he believed had been unjustly accused. He acted, he took the risk, he put himself between an accused man and a powerful king, and it cost him everything. The man who wrote the great book about the worthlessness of fortune's wheel had spent his life climbing it precisely in order to do good with the power it gave him, and fell from it precisely because he used that power to defend someone. So the consolation is not a teaching of withdrawal. The inner kingdom is not a place you hide. It is the secure ground you act from. The point of knowing that fortune cannot touch your true good is not that you then stop engaging with the world. It is that you can engage with the world freely, even bravely, even at terrible risk, because you know that the worst the world can do is take the wheel. And the wheel was never the thing that mattered. Boethius defended a friend knowing it might cost him everything on the wheel. And then when it did, he sat in the cell and proved in writing that the thing it could not cost him was the thing he had been right to keep safe all along. You build the inner kingdom not so you can retreat into it, but so that you are free enough and unafraid enough to do the right thing out in the world. That is the teaching. Everything else is commentary. Boethius was executed not long after he finished the Consolation of Philosophy around the year 524 on the order of the king he had served. He was in his mid-40s killed, and the book he had written in his cell went out into a world he would never see again. And that book did something almost no book does for the next 1,000 years, all through the long centuries that followed the fall of Rome. The Consolation of Philosophy was one of the most read, most copied, most translated, most beloved books in all of Europe. Kings translated it, scholars memorized it. Grieving and frightened people, century after century, opened it and were genuinely consoled. The condemned man in the cell became one of the great teachers of the Western world, and he never knew. And that is why he belongs on this channel at the far end of the ancient world. Boethius is the last of the great classical voices, writing as the lights of antiquity were going out around him. And what he chose to write with his last strength in his last place was a final, complete demonstration of the dividing line. He had stood at the very summit of fortune's wheel, and he had been carried all the way to the bottom of it, and he had lost every single thing the wheel can lend. And from the bottom in the cell, with the executioner coming, he wrote the proof, calm, lucid, and complete, that the wheel had never been able to reach the one kingdom that mattered. The guards took everything they could take. They could not enter the room where Boethius kept his mind. And in that room, condemned and alone, he wrote a book that consoled 1,000 years of readers he would never meet. And you do not need a cell or a sentence to use this. You only need to be a person who, while the wheel is still treating you, well, remembers that it is a wheel, who holds the good things as the loans they are. A person who spends some part of an ordinary day furnishing the inner kingdom, building the wisdom and the character that no guard can ever confiscate. And a person who, when a real loss finally comes, knows how to do what Boethius did to summon the wiser self. Give it a voice. Sit it down beside the grief. And let it console you not with the lie that nothing was lost, but with the truth that something remains, that something always remains, and that the something which remains was always the part most worth having. Stone and iron. Thank you for sitting with this one. If essays like this are useful to you, the channel is here for them. Subscribe if you want more.